Hello, my name is James, and every single man in my family has inexplicably died right at the age of 32 from a rare genetic condition. Or at least I thought so until I found my older brother Peter having a seizure last week. Peter had called me early that day stating that he didn't feel good and that he didn't want to spend his 32nd birthday alone. Knowing how important this age is in my family, I left work early and drove over to his house. As I neared the front door, I heard a loud scream. I quickly ran inside and saw Peter on the floor vigorously shaking. I quickly put a pillow under his head and went to call 911. However, right before I dialed, I heard a faint voice behind me. "Don't call that man. I'm fine," Peter said. "What the fuck are you talking about, man?" I said as I ran to his side. "I need to call ambulance. You just had a fucking seizure." "It's fine, dude. I've had a couple this week. I usually feel better after some rest," Peter said as he smiled up at me. "Fine, but I'm calling Mom," I said. With that, I helped Peter into bed and gave my mom a call. "Hello, James. How are you doing?" my mother asked. "Not so good. Peter had a seizure. Apparently he's been getting them all week," I said nervously. There was silence for a couple seconds before my mother spoke again with a cold, neutral tone. "James, I need to tell you about your father," she said sternly. "What?" I said as I psychically recoiled as the abrupt change to discussion. I don't remember much about my father, other than that his name was Patrick. I recently learned that my mother had Peter when she was 22 and my father was 25 due to a happy accident. At the time, they had attempted to make the most of the situation, and my father had been very involved for the first 2 years of Peter's life, going as far to try to have another child, me. According to my mother, shortly after she found out she was pregnant with me, my father's mental health had begun to rapidly decline. It was on the 16th anniversary of his father's passing, my mother said over the crackling of her phone. Patrick, your father, had gone to visit his mother as he did every anniversary. Usually he would be there for a couple hours, but this time he had been at his mother's place all night. I was about to call him when he stormed back into the house. "What does this have to do with Peter?" I asked impatiently as I paced back and forth. "Peter just had a seizure. This isn't the time to talk about Dad. He said that he needed to go to the hospital and get a vasectomy right away and that I had to get an abortion," my mother said, clearly choked up. "Jesus Christ. He wanted to abort me?" I said as I slowly slid down the wall onto the floor. I was absolutely appalled and shocked when he asked me to do that. I told him I would never under any circumstances, my mother said as she began to breathe heavily. That's when he had attempted to drug me to force a miscarriage. I couldn't even speak. Even though I had never met my father, I couldn't imagine someone doing such an unspeakable evil to someone that they loved and their unborn child. The silence lingered for a couple seconds before my mother continued. "I called the police after the drugging, and he had gotten 7 years in jail for attempted manslaughter charges. I didn't see him again until I had to testify at his trial. The whole time I was speaking, he wouldn't even look at me. It wasn't until his testimony that he confronted me directly." "What did he say?" I said as I held my hands up to my face. "He said that he loved me and you boys, but that he had made a serious mistake having you. He said it was his biggest regret. How could he say he loved me if he regretted having me so much?" I yelled, slowly getting angry at this man whom I had clearly never met. "I thought the same thing until a couple years ago when your grandmother had unexpectedly came by." "What the fuck are you talking about?" I said as I jumped to my feet. "Do you regret having me too?" My mother didn't respond and continued speaking. She had stopped by around 10 p.m. with an ancient-looking book with our last name on it. Before I could even ask her what an 88-year-old woman was doing up so late, she ushered me to the kitchen and sat me down. "What did she say?" I asked, utterly floored at the conversation I was having. "James, when I told you that your father had died from complications of a rare genetic disorder, I wasn't entirely telling you the truth." "Mom," I asked before she cut me off. "You need to listen. What is happening to your brother is the beginning of the process." "The process? What the fuck are you going on about?" I yelled. "It starts roughly 6 months after you turn 31. You first begin to rapidly bald. I remembered in that moment poking fun at Peter for his rapidly receding hairlines during one of family poker games and how mad my mother had gotten. Soon after, your skin begins to flake off and become almost scaly. I remember Peter calling me complaining about how he had suddenly been dealing with bad eczema. After a couple months of this, you begin having night terrors which lead to insomnia. Mom, Peter's been complaining about issues with sleep for the last couple weeks. What the fuck is happening? I screamed. My fear only amplified when I heard the sounds of breaking glass and screaming coming from the guest room where I had laid Peter down. I quickly dropped the phone and flung open the door to see Peter violently shaking on the ground surrounded by glass from a broken mirror. As I stared at him, he began to projectile vomit blood onto the blue carpet. Jesus Christ! I screamed as I ran to the phone to fail 911. Just as the operator began to ask me questions, I caught a glimpse of Peter from the reflection off a window that made me turn around in horror. As I stood motionless, I watched as a bulge in Peter's stomach began to form and travel up towards his neck. As it moved, Peter's limbs began to flail uncontrollably, as if the nerves which control them were short-circuiting. As the bulge reached his neck, his body ceased to move and his jaw began to stretch open until it nearly snapped. Suddenly, I saw a pair of hands pop out from the bloody crevice, desperately attempting to find a solid hold on Peter's mouth. As it pulled itself up, I saw a deformed head emerge from his throat, followed by a small torso. This creature, which was completely bald and covered in blood and organ matter, tumbled from Peter's corpse and onto the floor. "What are you?" I said shakily as I fell onto the bed. The creature then turned and looked at me and I screamed, causing it to crawl away rapidly. As it did, a cluster of tendrils began to pour out of Peter's mouth and follow behind the creature, leaving a trail of blood and glossy film. As it disappeared from the doorway, I blacked out. When I came to, I was in a mental stabilization until the nurse had told me that when the police arrived, that I had been found covered in blood and hugging Peter's body, and that I had been muttering, "It has his face," non-stop. According to them, it took giving me high doses of morphine for me to pass out. After 6 months of intensive care and a non-guilty verdict related to my brother's death, I was finally able to go home with my wife. As we parked the car in our driveway, she turned and gave me a big hug. "I'm so glad you're home, baby. I know how awful this year has been, but I have an amazing birthday present for you." "What is it?" I asked, having forgot that my birthday had been a week prior. "Well, I didn't know how to bring this up since you had your episode. But 5 months ago I found out that I'm pregnant," she said as she happily threw her arms around me. As she said those words, it was as if the whole world froze. "You're gonna be a dad to a healthy baby boy," she said as she kissed my cheek. As she pulled away, she must have seen how I was asking because she suddenly frowned. "What's wrong? Are you not happy?" she said as she tugged on my arm. Hearing her worry, I snapped out of my daze and smiled at her. "No, I'm fine. Sorry, I just remembered that I had to do something in the garage." "Okay," she said hesitantly, "but don't be too long. I'm gonna make us some dinner." I flashed her a smile before heading off into the garage. As I am currently writing this, I can't help but stare at my gun locker in the corner. I've always wanted to be a father that I never had. I ate healthy and exercised daily to make sure that I would be the first in my family to make it past 32. But I guess some curses can never truly be broken.